You gotta know what you're worth. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I'm gonna talk about a report that every service member has access to. It's a report that tells you things that can have a dramatic effect on your post-military decision-making. But it is very low profile. It's not easy to find, and I'll be honest, it's kind of difficult to locate information about how to interpret it. But I keep a copy on my desk, and you should get a copy too before you retire. This thing is called the Personal Statement of Military Compensation. And what this form does is it summarizes the total value of all your military pay, your allowances, and your benefits. There's really two reasons that this form is important, and they both have to do with the fact that the military gives you a lot more benefits than just the cash they put in your pocket. So the two ways that this summary can be important are, number one, when you're getting a loan, especially a mortgage. Mortgage brokers usually do a really simple debt-to-income calculation to determine how much of a mortgage you can afford. For a military person, if you only count your base pay, then you qualify for a smaller loan. And so this statement of compensation provides a nice official document that you can provide to a lender. Number two, when you're out of the military and looking for civilian jobs, you're going to get employment offers that lay out a compensation package with all kinds of different benefits. And the real question is, does that benefit package provide you with enough to maintain the lifestyle that you've been living? The only way you can possibly make a good comparison is if you have a copy of this report. All right, so the first thing I want to do is show you how to get your copy of this form. All you got to do is go to DFAS My Pay, and when you go to your account, it is the first document on the list. It's there even before your LES. Now, since I have a separated Army account, my personal statement of military compensation no longer populates. That's why you need to get a copy of it before you retire and keep it handy. So now, let's walk through the contents of this document. In fact, I'm going to show you the sections of my form because even though the title of the form is your personal statement, there is no genuinely personal information on this form. I mean, the data comes from sources with all kinds of personal information, but by the time it gets to this form, it really just describes somebody in your personal situation, not you personally. And the reason that I'm belaboring this point is because every single source of information that I've found on this personal statement of military compensation, what they've done is they've blurred out the data. And I think you guys deserve better. Okay. Right at the top, you get a summary of total compensation, and right away, you should notice that something looks a little weird. They never actually sum your total compensation. You see, this is less like an official statement and more like a worksheet where you have to go through and fill out portions of this form. But you can see that there are three major sections to this form. Direct compensation, that's the A, B, and C. The government's estimate of your indirect compensation, and then your estimate of some sort of unique benefits. Okay, so let's look at direct compensation. This is where you got three parts. Part A is where you've got your basic military compensation. That's your base pay, your BAS, and your BAH. That's all pretty simple, but I would encourage you to think about one thing. Your basic allowance for housing is location-based, so if you're stationed in one place, but you're considering a civilian job in another place, you might have to consider the difference in housing costs. Part B is your special pay and bonuses. Special pays would be like a special duty assignment pay or a foreign language proficiency pay. And do not forget your enlistment bonuses. From time to time, the Army offers massive incentives for people to join, and that can be a significant boost to your lifestyle without being immediately obvious in your day-to-day pay. Next, Part C gives you a slew of allowances that you might be getting. overseas housing allowance, cost of living allowance, family separation, clothing replacement. The thing to keep in mind with these allowances is that some of them, like the family separation allowance, they're based on your deployment. And so it might not be fair to make a comparison between that allowance and what you would get if you were back at your hometown. The next major section is your service estimated indirect compensation. And right off the bat, let's break down those 4 words. Compensation, that's just anything you get from your employer. So no big deal there. But indirect compensation, that's a benefit that you get because your employer is paying the bill. See, up to this point, we've been talking about direct compensation. That's where your employer puts the cash in your hand and you put that money in your pocket. Indirect compensation is when your employer doesn't give you the money, but they still pay for it and you still get the benefit. Some civilian examples might be like a company car or tickets to a sporting event. Now, the fact of the matter is that indirect compensation is always a little bit fuzzy. Analysts can get into huge arguments about whether they should use the market price or the actual sale price or the employee's perceived value. And because of that, this form has broken indirect compensation into 2 pieces. The service calculated indirect compensation, that's the part that can be derived pretty straightforwardly, and that's what we're talking about right now. And then there's your estimated indirect compensation, and that's the last major section. Okay, so the service calculated indirect compensation comes in 2 really big chunks: medical care and the federal tax advantage. And I'll tell you a little secret. I got out of the Army after 4 years and said I was never coming back. And the way they lured me back in was with TRICARE. Some of you may not know this, but in the civilian sector, your healthcare options can be extremely limited. And so what your employer pays for can cost an immense amount of money if you have to pay that bill yourself. I mean, at one point I was working in a manufacturing plant where there were tons of people in their 60s who were working almost solely to qualify for the employer-provided health care. So medical insurance is a huge deal, but it is really weird that this form does not place a dollar value on it. Instead, the fine print just rattles along about the out-of-pocket costs associated with TRICARE, but that's not at all what we're interested in here. So I dug up a 2005 RAND study that attempted to put a value on the active duty healthcare program. The bottom line is that for a young family, health insurance that was comparable to TRICARE would cost somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000. Accounting for inflation from 2005 to 2023, that puts it somewhere in the range of like $5,000 to $7,000. Now, the federal tax advantage, that's a lot more straightforward. Basically, your BAS and your BAH are tax exempt. So the form calculates how much those benefits would have to go up to provide the same value if they were taxed by the federal government. And just to be clear here, your civilian employer is never going to be giving you tax-exempt cash. So you're going to have to consider tax liabilities in this comparison. Okay, the third and final major section is called the additional considerations. These are your estimates of the value of your indirect compensation. And remember how I said that this form is more like a worksheet than a report? That really is true in this section because you got to put your own numbers to these different programs and policies and benefits. First benefit that this form addresses is your retirement benefit. That's your pension plan and the TSP. Now, I'm not going to get into a long conversation about how to put a dollar value on these specific benefits, other than to point out that the pension is a defined benefit program, while TSP is a defined contribution program. The civilian world really doesn't offer defined benefit plans anymore, but the civilian equivalent to the TSP is what's called a 401k account. Next, there's this collection of death and survivor benefits. The first one is just your service members' group life insurance. Now, while you're on active duty, you pay for soldiers' group life insurance out of pocket. So you might wonder why that would count as a benefit. The reason is that it is group life insurance. That means The policy averages risk over all of the group members. That is a lot of 18 to 22-year-olds who are never going to see combat. So the cost is remarkably low. And since it's group life insurance, service members don't have to submit to a medical examination in order to qualify for it. The reason all that matters is because if you're some retiring master sergeant with a collection of medical problems, replacing your service member group life insurance can be pretty expensive. The second death benefit listed is really a collection of benefits. The death gratuity is just $100,000 that goes to your family when you die. And to my way of thinking, this is just life insurance that's provided by your employer. The Veterans Administration's dependent and indemnity compensation, it's a little different, but fundamentally, it's still just a version of life insurance. Under certain circumstances, if a service member dies, their family receives a monthly payment. DIC works kind of like a pension, kind of like a disability. It isn't really either of those things, but it's a sizable benefit that can be difficult to replace in the civilian sector. The next thing in this subgroup of death benefits is a housing allowance that goes to your family. And then the final death and survival program is good old survivor benefit program. We normally talk a lot about the survivor benefit program right around retirement. And the reason for that is because while you're on active duty, the military pays for that program. And when you transition into retirement, you have to cover the cost yourself. So this is a lot of life insurance. And putting a dollar figure on all of it, well, it can be kind of complex and based on a lot of personal variables. If you want a very quick and dirty way to estimate this, take 50% of your current base pay and then multiply that by 12%. In a very rough sense, that will approximate what it would cost for you to independently insure your pension. That is a lot, and we still have a ways to go here. Next is pay growth, and again, it is not easy to put a dollar figure on this, but it's worth noting that military service members get pay raises based on what's called the Employee Cost Index. The ECI is a value that's reported by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and what it does is it measures growth in the cost of the civilian labor market. It's kind of similar to the Consumer Price Index that measures increases in the costs of things that consumers buy. But in this case, it's measuring the cost of employees that employers are paying for. So military pay grows at a rate that's similar to the civilian sector unless Congress steps in and authorizes a bigger increase. They have been doing this a lot over the last few decades. The reason this matters is because a lot of civilian jobs do not give annual pay raises that keep pace with the ECI. I mean, the ECI is an average, so there's plenty of people who are getting a lower pay raise or no raise at all. Over the length of a career, that can have a big effect. Next, we have state and local taxes. Basically, while you're on active duty, you have access to some state tax advantages. My home of record was Pennsylvania, so I didn't pay state taxes on anything I earned outside of the state. Now that I'm out, I pay state taxes. To estimate your new tax liability, well, you figure out what your state's tax rate is, you multiply it times that total compensation at the beginning of the form, and you got your number. Finally, you got a laundry list of services and benefits that different service members use to different levels. Commissary, AFES, counseling, MWR, education programs, counseling, legal services, space available. Hey, I got huge advantages from that, but some people get zero advantage from it. And then a couple more healthcare programs. Okay, so what do you do with this information aside from just getting overwhelmed? Well, here's the big thing. When you get a job offer from a civilian employer, you want to be prepared to compare that offer to these numbers. You might discover that you're getting more dollars in your pocket, but getting significantly less in total benefits. And before we wrap up, let me foot stomp this one. After you retire, DFAS no longer posts a personal statement of military compensation. Mine is gone. So go in there, download a copy, and keep it someplace safe. Now, if you're looking for a shorter video, one that considers what kind of certification you can get before you transition out of the military, watch this one.